David Miller had always been a creature of habit, and tonight was no different. With precision that echoed years of practice, he navigated his modest, slightly worn-out sedan through the labyrinth of his suburban neighborhood. His house, a two-story dwelling indistinguishable from its brethren, stood bathed in the silvery luminescence of a single streetlight. The light, though feeble, cast long shadows that seemed to dance mockingly on the quiet street. David, a middle-aged man whose physique bore the brunt of long hours on the road and fast food dinners, had an air of weary resignation about him. His suit, once a sharp charcoal gray, was now tinged with the familiarity and slight disrepair that came with frequent use. It clung to his frame, slightly wrinkled and mismatched with a tired-looking tie. His eyes, set deep in a face lined more from stress than age, had a certain dullness to them, the kind that came from countless nights spent in roadside motels. His hair, a mix of black and gray, lay unkempt and slightly oily, brushed hastily to the side as an afterthought. David's movements were mechanical as he loaded his sedan. The suitcases, old and battered, were thrown into the trunk with a practiced air of detachment. Sales catalogs, sample products, and an assortment of personal belongings were haphazardly strewn around the car's interior. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked to life as he turned the key in the ignition, its neon green numerals reading 12:01 a.m. The car grumbled to a start, its familiar vibrations offering a fleeting comfort. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting a gaze that seemed almost foreign. The years on the road had changed him, and sometimes he wondered if he recognized the man staring back. With a sigh, David shifted the gear and eased the car onto the main road. The street was bathed in darkness, save for the occasional flicker of a passing streetlight. Highway 97 stretched out before him, an unending snake of asphalt that disappeared into the moonless night. The road was familiar, almost too much so, and yet tonight it seemed to hold a different air about it, something quiet, desolate, and eerily isolating. As he drove, the houses thinned out, giving way to dense clusters of trees whose branches hung low, like silent sentinels guarding a forgotten realm. David's car seemed to be the only sign of life amidst the enveloping darkness, its headlights carving a tunnel of light through the silent and foreboding night. And so began David Miller's journey, an innocuous start to what promised to be a night like any other. Or so he believed, as he delved deeper into the abyss of the night along the desolate stretch of Highway 97. The stretch of Highway 97 that David found himself on was known to be infrequently traveled at this hour, but tonight it felt unusually eerily barren. The road unfurled before him like an inky ribbon, the markings barely visible and seemingly leading to nowhere. The monotonous hum of the car's tires against the asphalt usually brought David a sense of reassuring constancy, but this time it failed to anchor him. The darkness around him seemed almost tangible, a vast and all-encompassing void that swallowed everything in its path. The only respite came from his car's headlights, which cut through the night like two bright, unblinking eyes. They cast long, wavering beams that barely managed to pierce the gloom, providing just enough illumination to navigate the winding road. On either side of the highway, dense trees stood tall and foreboding, their branches gnarled and twisted like the hands of specters reaching out from the shadows. The wind whispered through the leaves, creating an eerie symphony that seemed almost like hushed voices conversing in a language long forgotten. Each gust of wind sent the branches into a frenetic dance, casting grotesque and capricious shadows that seemed to dart and play just beyond the reach of the light. David tried to seek solace in the familiarity of his routine. He had traversed this path countless times before, each journey much like the last. He knew every curve, every rise and fall of the road like the back of his hand, and yet tonight the landscape seemed alien and unwelcoming. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white under the pressure. He tried to shake off the creeping sense of isolation that clung to him like a cold mist. He turned on the radio, seeking the comforting chatter of a late-night talk show or the familiar strains of a classic rock song. But the airwaves were filled with static. the crackling noise seeming to mirror the chaotic thoughts swirling in his mind. David frowned, adjusting the dials and pressing buttons in an attempt to find a signal. But the static persisted, an unrelenting cacophony in the otherwise silent night. The comforting hum of the road that usually accompanied him seemed to be swallowed whole, devoured by the oppressive and almost tangible atmosphere around him. His heart began to beat a little faster, a silent acknowledgement of the anomaly. Every mile he covered seemed to distance him further from reality and deeper into an isolating solitude. He shook his head, chiding himself for succumbing to the irrational fear that seemed to grip him. But the road ahead continued to stretch, unchanging and relentless. And David couldn't quite shake the feeling that tonight, something was amiss. Attempting to quell the unease that had begun to gnaw at the edges of his mind, David's hand instinctively gravitated towards the car's radio. The dashboard, bathed in a soft glow from the instrument panel, seemed almost welcoming in contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. He turned the knob, hoping for the soothing melodies of a late-night jazz station, or perhaps the lively banter of a radio host to break through the isolation. However, what greeted him was an unsettling crackle of static that buzzed and popped through the speakers. It sounded erratic, almost alive, as if the radio was struggling to tune into frequencies that were just out of reach. The monotonous drone and occasional high-pitched squeals seemed to amplify his growing discomfort rather than alleviate it. As the static persisted, David's gaze flitted nervously back to the road. The trees on the roadside, previously just a backdrop to his journey, now seemed more pronounced in the darkness. Their shadows, accentuated by the intermittent flicker of his headlights, appeared to dance and sway with a life of their own. His heart began to race involuntarily as his imagination, perhaps fueled by the isolation and the late hour, began to conjure sinister shapes from the inky blackness. Each twist and turn of the road seemed to reveal fleeting glimpses of figures that were there one moment and gone the next. Shadows morphed into lurking figures that disappeared as quickly as they came, playing tricks on his strained eyes. The static from the radio continued its erratic symphony, and David's nerves felt like they were fraying with each mile he covered. The crackling noise, interspersed with occasional almost voices that seemed to bubble up from the interference, was doing nothing to calm his heightened senses. With a frustrated sigh, David decided that the oppressive silence of the night was preferable to the unsettling cacophony that the radio offered. He reached out and shut the radio off, the abrupt silence enveloping the car like a heavy blanket. The only sounds now were the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thudding of the tires on the asphalt. The quietude, while offering a reprieve from the nerve-grating static, did little to alleviate his sense of foreboding. His own shallow breaths and the pounding of his heart seemed to fill the car, making him acutely aware of his isolation. The road continued to unravel before him, and David tried to focus on the drive. Yet the disconcerting feeling persisted, casting a pall over his journey. The desolate expanse of Highway 97 continued to unfurl before David, each stretch of asphalt seeming to mirror the one before it. As he drove, a disconcerting sense of déjà vu began to gnaw at him. It started subtly, a mere whisper of familiarity in the back of his mind. However, as the miles ticked away, that whisper grew louder, morphing into an unmistakable feeling that he had traversed this same stretch of road before. It was the crooked tree that first captured his attention, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the night. David could have sworn he'd seen it before, perhaps a few minutes ago, but he shrugged it off, attributing the similarity to the monotonous landscape. However, as he continued, the same winding bend in the road appeared again, its curve unmistakable and eerily familiar. His mind began to race, desperately trying to reconcile the impossibility of what he was experiencing. The landscape seemed to be stuck in a loop, the same landmarks recurring like a haunting refrain. His surroundings were playing on repeat, and David found himself ensnared in this bizarre, unending cycle. Trying to brush off the eerie feeling, David laughed nervously. The sound was an attempt to inject some semblance of normalcy into the bizarre situation. Speaking aloud to himself, he tried to rationalize the situation, craving the sound of a human voice, even if it was his own, amidst the silent and watchful trees. "Get a grip, David," he muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the confines of the car. "You're just tired, that's all. All these trees look the same in the dark." But instead of providing comfort, his own words seemed to be swallowed up by the car's interior, as if absorbed by the oppressive atmosphere surrounding him. The space inside the vehicle, which once felt like a protective cocoon, now seemed stifling, and his own voice sounded hollow and alien. His laughter, intended to diffuse the tension, instead heightened his growing panic. The sound was brittle, and it did not carry the reassurance he so desperately sought. The encroaching silence that followed was almost suffocating, making the interior of the car feel even more isolating. His heartbeat quickened, and his hands, now clammy, tightened around the steering wheel. His eyes darted around, half expecting the crooked tree and the winding bend to materialize again. The loop, the silence, and his own echoing words created a symphony of psychological disarray, making him question not just his surroundings, but his very sanity. David's thoughts spiraled, oscillating between denial and burgeoning fear. The road ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, and the feeling of being trapped in this eerie loop was inescapable. The unsettling repetition of the landscape had turned his once mundane journey into a chilling puzzle with no discernible solution. The journey had been long and monotonous, the road stretching out ahead of David like an unending ribbon through the night. The only sounds that accompanied him were the rhythmic hum of his car's engine and the occasional gust of wind that seemed to whisper through the trees lining the highway. The night had swallowed the world whole, leaving only the narrow stretch of road visible in the car's headlights. As David navigated the desolate highway, his eyelids heavy from exhaustion, he was jolted awake by a sudden, inexplicable movement. It was a fleeting blur at the edge of his peripheral vision, an ephemeral shadow that seemed to dart across the road. Instinctively, his foot slammed down on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest against the asphalt. The car lurched to a sudden, heart-stopping halt. David's breath caught in his throat as he squinted into the oppressive darkness ahead. Nothing. The road was empty, bathed only in the feeble glow of his headlights, which seemed to struggle against the all-encompassing night. His heart pounded in his chest, a staccato rhythm that echoed loudly in the silence of the car. His palms, clammy and trembling, gripped the steering wheel tightly as beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Perplexed and rattled, David's mind raced to make sense of what he thought he had seen. Was it an animal? A trick of the light? Or perhaps, he thought with a shiver, it was a figment of his imagination, conjured up by the isolation of the road and the late hour. He scanned the surroundings, but the shadows cast by the trees seemed to flicker and dance just beyond the reach of his headlights, as though taunting him. He blinked, trying to dispel the fatigue that clung to him and rationalize what had just transpired. His mind, strained from the long hours on the road, seemed to play tricks on him, making the benign appear sinister and the ordinary seem fraught with hidden dangers. He questioned himself, his senses, and the very reality of what he had perceived. The night around him seemed to take on a mocking tone, the shadows imbued with a malevolent life of their own. Every rustle of the leaves, every whisper of the wind, seemed laden with eerie intent. David felt a chill crawl up his spine as he sat there, caught between the desire to dismiss what he had seen as a mere illusion and an unsettling feeling that he was not alone. With trepidation, he released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and tried to steady his nerves. His eyes darted once more along the road, half expecting some phantom figure to emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching onward, waiting for him to continue his journey through the night that now seemed so much more enigmatic and foreboding than before. The highway unfurled before David like a ribbon through an abyss, each mile indistinguishable from the last. His eyes, weary and bloodshot, strained to discern any deviation in the monotonous stretch of asphalt that seemed to vanish into the inky blackness ahead. David's perception of time and space seemed to warp and distort as the road continued its relentless, winding course through the desolate landscape. He yearned for some semblance of normalcy, a beacon of civilization in this forsaken place. He longed to see the comforting neon glow of a motel sign or the welcoming lights of a late-night diner. anything to break the eerie sameness that enveloped him. His eyes darted anxiously from side to side, scanning the impenetrable darkness for a signpost, a turnoff, any indication that he was not utterly alone in this surreal journey. But none came. The highway stretched on and on, a seemingly infinite loop of isolation. David's mind began to feel as foggy as the murky night outside. He rummaged through the cluttered glove compartment for his phone, seeking the familiar comfort of a friendly voice or a text message. But when he retrieved the device, his heart sank. The screen was a lifeless black, the battery having long since given up its charge. He fumbled with the car charger, but it was futile. The phone remained unresponsive, as dead as the desolate road he traversed. A claustrophobic sense of isolation began to encase David, as if the walls of the car were closing in on him. The silence within the confines of his vehicle seemed almost deafening, amplifying each breath he took, each heartbeat echoing in his chest. The void outside seemed to press against the windows, a tangible entity that sought to infiltrate his sanctuary on wheels. His own thoughts became unwanted companions, whispering doubts and fears that gnawed at his resolve. The car, once a protective cocoon, now felt like a prison hurtling through an abyss. The hum of the engine, usually a comforting background drone, now seemed to mock him with its monotonous purr. Each turn of the wheels echoed the empty passage of time. His mind raced, grasping at rational explanations for his predicament. Could he have taken a wrong turn? Was he trapped in some sort of geographical anomaly, a stretch of road forgotten by time and progress? Every logical explanation seemed to crumble under the oppressive isolation that surrounded him. His hands, white-knuckled and clammy, gripped the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline anchoring him to reality. He willed himself to focus, to maintain control amidst the unraveling fabric of his understanding. Yet the road offered no solace, no respite. It stretched ahead, unchanging and unyielding, as David continued his drive through the endless night, grappling with the encroaching silence and the gnawing isolation that sought to consume him. Driven to the brink of his wits by the relentless solitude and disorienting repetition of the highway, David's desperation reached a crescendo. He couldn't bear the oppressive confines of the car any longer. The space that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to be suffocating him. With a sudden surge of determination, he brought the car to a screeching halt, the tires squealing in protest against the lonely stretch of asphalt. He fumbled hastily with the door handle, and as the door swung open, the interior light briefly cast an artificial glow on the surroundings. But as he stepped out, the light faded away, swallowed by the all-encompassing darkness that lay before him. The car, now just a silhouette against the night, seemed to be the last vestige of the world he knew. The silence outside was profound and almost tangible, as if the night itself was holding its breath, watching him with unseen eyes. The air was still, charged with an energy that seemed ancient and malevolent. It prickled against his skin, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Each footstep seemed to echo in the void, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. David squinted, trying to pierce the impenetrable blackness that lay ahead. The road, which had been merely a means to an end, had transformed in his mind into something far more sinister. It was no longer just asphalt and painted lines. It felt like a pathway into an eldritch realm, a dimension that defied all logic and understanding. He stood there for a moment, the isolation pressing in on him from all sides. The world he knew seemed like a distant memory, and the road ahead was an enigma wrapped in shadows. It was as if he had crossed an invisible threshold into a place that existed outside of time and space, a place that was waiting to reveal its secrets to an unwilling traveler. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady his nerves. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh heavily upon him, bearing down like a tangible force. His eyes darted frantically around, searching for something, anything, that would anchor him back to reality. The road beneath his feet seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost alive, its surface no longer cold and unyielding, but almost spongy, like the flesh of some great beast. The boundaries between the natural and the supernatural seemed to blur, and David felt a rising tide of panic threatening to engulf him. His mind raced, torn between the desire to flee back to the dubious safety of his car, or to venture forth into the unknown that beckoned him with an eerie allure. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound, but seemed to have a voice of its own, whispering promises and threats in equal measure. In this liminal space, caught between the world he knew and the abyss that lay before him, David's desperation clawed at his sanity. The road, this seemingly endless stretch of asphalt, had become a nightmarish landscape that tested the limits of his understanding and courage. Without warning, the steady hum of the car's engine began to falter. The comforting vibrations beneath David's feet weakened, shuddering sporadically like the dying heartbeat of some mechanical beast. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles turning white as he willed the car to continue. But despite his desperate coaxing, the vehicle gave one last juddering breath before falling silent, leaving him stranded amidst the ominous stillness. The dashboard lights, which had provided a small oasis of illumination in the otherwise engulfing darkness, flickered momentarily before succumbing to the night. The sudden absence of sound and light was almost tangible, as if the darkness had weight and volume, pouring into the car and swallowing him whole. Outside, shadows seemed to move of their own volition, whispering and curling around the car like tendrils of smoke. The wind picked up, carrying with it unintelligible murmurs that sounded like hushed voices engaged in a secret conversation just beyond his comprehension. Each rustle of the leaves and creak of the branches seemed laden with intent, and the darkness appeared to press against the windows, probing for a way in. Inside the car, David's own thoughts began to turn traitorous. His mind conjured up images of spectral figures lurking just outside the periphery of his vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The isolation and oppressive atmosphere began to distort his sense of reality, and his heart pounded loudly in his chest, as if trying to escape the confines of his own body. Panic-stricken and desperate for some semblance of security, David fumbled hastily with the door, pulling it shut with a resounding slam that briefly cut through the symphony of whispers outside. His hands shook as he hurriedly locked the doors, the metallic click sounding both reassuring and final. He pressed his back against the driver's seat, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, as he stared wide-eyed into the impenetrable darkness beyond the windows. The car, now rendered powerless and immobile, became both a cage and a sanctuary. The familiar interior, with its worn-out upholstery and faint scent of stale coffee, seemed to be the only thing separating him from the malevolent unknown outside. He felt trapped, caught in a limbo between the urge to flee and the instinct to hide. His heart raced uncontrollably, and his entire being seemed to vibrate with a primal fear. Though no tangible threat presented itself, the very air seemed charged with a sinister energy that seeped into David's bones, paralyzing him with dread. Each shadow seemed to harbor an unseen menace, and the silence was filled with the echoes of his own racing thoughts, turning over and over in a cacophony of panic. In that moment, ensconced in the dim confines of his car, David felt a vulnerability he had never known before. The darkness outside was no longer just a lack of light. It had transformed into an entity, a living, breathing antagonist that sought to unmake him. The whispers of the shadows seemed to mock him, playing on his fears and heightening his sense of isolation. Locked within his car, amidst the oppressive and unrelenting dark, David's senses were held hostage by an unseen, unfathomable threat that seemed to emanate from the very night itself. Just as suddenly as it had descended into silence, the car shuddered and gasped, seemingly resurrecting itself from mechanical death. The engine roared back to life with an intensity that seemed almost defiant, as if challenging the oppressive darkness around it. The dashboard lights flickered momentarily before stabilizing, bathing the interior of the car in a comforting glow. The headlights pierced the night, scattering the shadows that had seemed so menacing just moments before. David, still grappling with the remnants of his panic, wasted no time in second-guessing this unexpected reprieve. His hands, now steady with adrenaline-fueled resolve, gripped the steering wheel as he slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The car surged forward, tires gripping the asphalt with newfound urgency. The road, which had seemed like an endless pathway into some unfathomable abyss, now stretched before him like a ribbon of salvation. guiding him away from the night's eerie clutches. As he drove, the oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the night began to lift, as though the car's sudden revival had shattered the unseen bonds that held the darkness in place. The road unfurled beneath the car's headlights, no longer a menacing path, but just a stretch of ordinary highway, winding its way through the night. Gradually, the first tendrils of dawn began to creep across the sky, casting a pale light that grew steadily stronger. The world around David started to take on familiar shapes and colors, the eerie shadows of the night giving way to the ordinary and mundane. Trees, once twisted and whispering conspirators, now stood benignly along the roadside, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The asphalt, which had seemed like a pathway into an eldritch realm, now appeared as it truly was, a well-traveled highway leading towards civilization and safety. As the sun continued its ascent, casting its light over the landscape, David's surroundings transformed. The ordinary world, with all its commonplace features, came into sharp focus. The night's terrors seemed to evaporate in the growing light, like a nightmare fading upon waking. David's mind raced, trying to make sense of the experience. Had it all been a figment of his imagination, a product of fatigue and isolation? Or had he truly brushed up against something beyond the realm of understanding? The road, now bathed in the soft hues of dawn, offered no answers. The trees stood silent, the asphalt indifferent, and the once menacing shadows retreated into the forgotten corners of the night. His heart still pounding, but now with relief rather than fear, David continued to drive. The morning light brought with it a sense of normalcy and calm, casting doubt on the reality of the night's events. He questioned himself, wondering if the isolation and darkness had conjured up the entire ordeal. Had it been a dream, a mere trick of his own mind? As he drove on, the landscape around him awakening to a new day, David was left with a lingering sense of wonder and unease. The boundary between reality and imagination seemed blurred, leaving him with more questions than answers. The road ahead was clear, but the memories of the night clung to him, an enigma that would remain long after the dawn had fully broken. David finally arrived at his modest home, a neat suburban haven that had always been his sanctuary. As he pulled into the driveway, the first rays of the sun were painting the sky with hues of pink and gold. The house, with its manicured lawn and carefully tended flower beds, had always been a symbol of normalcy and safety for him. Yet, as he turned off the ignition and stepped out of the car, something felt distinctly amiss. The door creaked open to welcome him, and he stepped into the familiar space of his living room. The couch, the television, the family photos adorning the walls, everything was exactly as he had left it, but it all seemed subtly alien. The rooms were filled with the same furniture, the same comforting smells, and yet they seemed to be tinged with an otherness that he could not shake off. It was as if he was viewing his own life through a distorting lens, rendering everything slightly off-kilter. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, his own footsteps sounding foreign and intrusive. He felt like a trespasser in his own sanctuary, an intruder in a life that had once been as familiar as the lines on his palm. Every shadow seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and every reflection seemed to hint at something lurking just out of sight. The echoes of Highway 97 continued to haunt him, whispers of darkness that seemed to seep into the very corners of his being. The memory of the twisted shadows and the oppressive silence lingered, leaving a stain on his consciousness that he couldn't wash away. It was as if the road had opened a door in his mind, revealing glimpses of realms that defied understanding and rationality. As he tried to settle back into the rhythms of his life, David found that the experience had irrevocably altered him. The once comforting routine of his existence now seemed superficial, barely concealing the lurking unknown that the night had revealed to him. He would catch himself staring into space, the mundane tasks of his daily life momentarily forgotten, as the shadows of that highway danced in his mind. The road had shown him something, a dark whisper, a hint that reality was a fragile veneer barely masking the incomprehensible. He knew that he had touched something ancient and unfathomable, and that knowledge had left him changed. His every waking moment was tinged with a sense of disquiet, and his dreams were filled with endless highways and whispering shadows. David understood, with a clarity that was both unsettling and profound, that certain doors once opened could never truly be closed again. The experience had embedded itself in the fabric of his being, an indelible mark that colored his perception of the world around him. He had journeyed beyond the familiar and returned, but the echoes of that otherness persisted, haunting whispers that would accompany him always.